An Iranian aircraft was already in the air, already over Omani airspace, already heading toward Yemen when it got turned around. No warning shots, no missiles, just a flat refusal to let it land, and a return flight back to where it came from. That happened on July 19th, and it's the second time in less than 3 weeks that an Iranian aircraft trying to reach Sanaa has ended up in exactly this position. Today, we're breaking down what actually happened, why Saudi Arabia and the Houthis are suddenly at the center of a story that's supposed to be about the U.S. and Iran, and why one of these incidents ended with Saudi jets themselves being the ones forced to retreat. Stick with me, because the real version of this story is stranger and more layered than the headlines are making it sound. Let's start with the most recent incident, because it's the freshest and it sets up everything else that follows in this story. On July 19th, Yemen's Minister of Transport, Mohsen al-Omari, announced that a planned flight by Iran's Mahan Air to Sanaa had been halted. According to his statement, the aircraft was denied permission to continue while it was still over Omani airspace, and it was forced to turn back before it ever got close to Yemeni territory. Neither Iranian authorities nor the Houthis, who control Sanaa and much of northern Yemen, issued any official statement explaining what was actually on that flight or why it mattered enough to stop. That silence is worth sitting with for a second, because when both sides of an incident go quiet instead of trading accusations, that usually means there's something neither of them wants to explain in public. All right, 30 seconds in, here's where we're headed. We're going to go back to the earlier incident, the one that actually involved Saudi jets getting forced out of the sky, because that's the piece of this story that's been getting buried under all the noise about the wider Iran war. We're going to explain why Yemen's airspace has suddenly become this pressure point between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the Houthis. We're going to look at what Saudi Arabia has actually endured throughout this entire conflict, because it's a lot more than most coverage is giving credit for. And then we're going to connect all of it to the bigger picture, because Riyadh's position in this war is genuinely one of the most complicated of any country involved. So let's go back about 3 weeks, to early July, because this is where the actual Saudi jets forced to retreat story comes from. And it's a wild one once you see how it actually unfolded on the ground. According to Houthi military spokesperson Yahya Sari, Saudi warplanes attempted to block an Iranian passenger aircraft from landing at Sanaa International Airport. This wasn't a routine flight either. Houthi media reported the plane was carrying more than 200 stranded, wounded, and sick Iranian citizens, along with a Houthi delegation that had been trying to attend the funeral ceremonies for Iran's former supreme leader, who had been killed in the U.S.-Israeli strikes that triggered this entire war back on February 28th. According to Sari's account, Houthi forces used air defense missiles to intercept the Saudi aircraft, attempting to block that landing, forcing the Saudi jets to leave Yemeni airspace entirely. The Houthis went further, saying their fighters were ready for what they called any options, with their fingers on the trigger to implement directives aimed at breaking what they described as the Saudi-American siege. Now, I want to be straight with you about sourcing here, because that account comes primarily from the Houthi side, and Saudi Arabia hasn't confirmed that version of events in the same level of detail. But here's what makes it credible enough to take seriously. This wasn't an isolated one-off. It fits directly into a pattern that's been running since at least April, when Saudi jets bombed and destroyed the runway at Sanaa's airport, specifically to stop an earlier Iranian plane carrying humanitarian aid from landing, an incident confirmed at the time by Iran's own foreign ministry, which summoned Riyadh's top diplomat in Tehran to formally protest. So the pattern here isn't new. Saudi Arabia has a track record going back years of physically preventing Iranian aircraft from reaching Sanaa, and the Houthis, who are backed by Iran, have just as consistently treated that as an act of war against Yemeni sovereignty rather than a security measure. Here's the part that connects everything together, and it's the piece I think matters most out of everything in this entire story. The day after that, Mahan Air flight got turned back on July 19th. Houthi military spokesperson Yahya Sari went on Al Masirah television and announced something significant. He said a ban on maritime transport linked to Saudi Arabia had come into effect, describing it as what he called a blockade for blockade response to what the Houthis characterize as a roughly 12-year blockade that's been imposed on Yemen. Sari said Yemen's armed forces were prepared for all options, but didn't specify the exact scope or geographic areas the maritime blockade would cover. And almost immediately after that announcement, the Houthis followed through. Sari declared the incident with the Iranian flight would not go unanswered, and shortly afterward announced that Abha Airport in southern Saudi Arabia had been targeted by ballistic missiles and drones. Turki al-Maliki, spokesperson for the Saudi-led coalition, confirmed that air defense systems had been activated against the incoming missiles and that the threat had been neutralized with no casualties reported, a pattern of successful interception that has held up repeatedly throughout this war, even as the frequency of attacks against Saudi territory has continued. So look at the sequence here, because it tells a clear story once you lay it out in order, step by step, rather than as a jumble of disconnected headlines the way most coverage has presented it. Iranian plane gets turned back over Omani airspace. Within roughly 24 hours, the Houthis announce a maritime blockade targeting Saudi shipping. And almost immediately after that, missiles and drones are fired at a Saudi airport in direct retaliation. That's not three unrelated news items. That's a single escalation chain, each step provoking the next, all tracing back to one aircraft that never even made it to Yemeni soil. And the fallout from that Abba strike didn't stop there either, and this is where the story actually widens out well beyond just one airport. According to reporting from the OPS Group Aviation Monitoring Service, that same round of Houthi attacks forced the temporary closure of 4 separate airports across southern Saudi Arabia, Abba, Jizan, Najran, and Sharura, all grounded under official notice until at least 3 p.m. Mshazulu time. The Houthis also issued a direct warning to international airlines, telling them not to use Saudi airspace at all until the restrictions on Sanaa Airport were lifted, and stating plainly and repeatedly that attacks would continue until that happened. Think about what that actually means for a second. A dispute that started over one passenger flight carrying wounded civilians and a funeral delegation has escalated into a group threatening the safety of international commercial aviation across an entire kingdom's airspace. Yemen's own government responded with real urgency too, treating this as far more than a routine diplomatic dispute. Rashad al-Alimi, president of Yemen's internationally recognized Presidential Leadership Council, ordered the government, military, and security forces to raise their readiness to the highest level, and specifically framed the attempt to land that Iranian aircraft as a serious provocation. So you've now got 3 separate governments: Saudi Arabia, the Houthi administration in Sanaa, and Yemen's internationally recognized government based elsewhere in the country, all reacting to the fallout from a single Mahan Air flight that got turned around before it ever touched down. Now let's zoom out and talk about Saudi Arabia's actual position in this broader war, because I think it's genuinely one of the most underappreciated angles of the entire conflict, and one that deserves far more attention than the headline-grabbing strikes and threats coming out of Washington and Tehran. Saudi Arabia isn't a combatant by choice here. Going all the way back to January, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman made a direct public commitment that the kingdom would not permit its airspace or its territory to be used for military action against Iran by any party, regardless of origin, a position he affirmed during a phone call with Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian, in which he specifically emphasized that Saudi Arabia respects Iran's sovereignty. That's a Gulf monarchy, sitting right next door to Iran, publicly refusing to let itself become a staging ground for American or Israeli operations against Tehran. And Iran has repaid that restraint with direct attacks anyway. According to documented strikes across this war, Iranian missiles and drones have landed inside Saudi territory since February, hitting civilian airports and oil infrastructure, prompting the Saudi cabinet to formally state it will take all necessary measures to defend the kingdom's security, territory, citizens, and residents. Saudi Arabia's foreign ministry condemned what it called Iran's attacks on civilian airports and oil infrastructure as a violation of international law and a deliberate attempt to destabilize the region, and went as far as warning that if Iran pressed ahead, it would bear the heaviest diplomatic, economic, and strategic consequences and become what the ministry called the biggest loser in the conflict. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, together with UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, issued a joint warning that continued Iranian attacks on other Gulf states could trigger a wider regional escalation. And on March 21st, Riyadh went further still, expelling Iranian defense officials from the country entirely, giving them just 24 hours to leave. So here's the picture that emerges. Saudi Arabia tried to stay out of the American and Israeli fight against Iran, refused to offer its territory for that purpose, and got attacked anyway. In response, it's been quietly rebuilding its own defenses rather than escalating rhetorically. Reporting indicates a Saudi arms company signed a deal to buy interceptor missiles from Ukraine, and Pakistan, which signed a mutual defense agreement with Saudi Arabia back in September of 2025, has since deployed thousands of troops and fighter jets to the kingdom, with Pakistan's foreign minister publicly stating he reminded Iran of that mutual defense commitment. This is a country trying to build a defensive shield around itself, while staying formally neutral in the fight everyone else is having, and getting pulled deeper into the war anyway through exactly the kind of incident that just played out over Sanaa's airspace. Let's dig deeper into what Saudi Arabia has actually absorbed throughout this war, because the scale of it tends to get lost in coverage that's mostly focused on Iran versus the United States. Documented Iranian strikes on Saudi territory during this conflict have included attacks specifically targeting civilian airports and oil infrastructure, according to the Saudi cabinet's own public statements. That's a meaningful detail. This isn't a country that's been drawn into exchanging fire with Iranian military assets along some contested border. This is a country whose civilian aviation infrastructure and energy exports, the backbone of its entire economy, have been directly targeted while it was doing everything in its power to stay formally uninvolved in the fight between Washington and Tehran. That's part of why the response from Riyadh has been so layered. It's not just diplomatic condemnation, though there's been plenty of that. It's also concrete defensive investment. The interceptor missile deal with a Ukrainian supplier is a particularly interesting detail because it signals Saudi Arabia diversifying its air defense procurement away from an exclusively American supply chain at a moment when American attention and resources are already stretched across strikes on Iran, support for Israel, and now this unfolding situation around Yemen. And the Pakistani deployment adds another layer entirely. Thousands of Pakistani troops and fighter jets, backed by a mutual defense agreement signed less than a year before this war even began, represent a level of foreign military presence on Saudi soil that would have been almost unthinkable in past decades, when the kingdom's security guarantees ran almost exclusively through Washington. Let's talk about why Yemen specifically has become this pressure point, because it's not random. According to safety monitoring services tracking Middle East airspace, Houthi forces in Yemen have been conducting missile and drone attacks, specifically targeting southern Saudi Arabia as part of the broader spillover from the Iran conflict throughout July, separate from and in addition to the retaliatory strike on Abha we just covered. The European Union Aviation Safety Agency has issued repeated advisories warning operators about the risk of flying through the region, and multiple airports across southern Saudi Arabia have faced repeated unpredictable closures as a direct result. Yemen sits in a strategically brutal position here. It's not directly part of the U.S.-Iran conflict, but because the Houthis are aligned with Tehran and hostile to the Saudi-led coalition that's fought them for years, every flashpoint involving Iranian aircraft trying to reach Yemeni territory automatically drags Saudi Arabia into a confrontation it never asked to be part of. And that dynamic isn't limited to just this one airspace dispute. According to the safety monitoring data, Iranian missiles and drones tied to the broader war have been landing inside Saudi Arabia throughout the conflict, without any significant downgrade in the airspace, warnings multiple countries maintain for the region. Despite all of that, Saudi airspace itself has remained open and has actually become one of the primary bypass routes for international air traffic, trying to avoid the more dangerous parts of the conflict zone entirely, with heavy overflight demand continuing through Jeddah's flight information region, even as the ground and airspace situation around it deteriorates. There's also a broader aviation safety dimension to all of this that's worth walking through, because it shows just how far the effects of this one dispute have rippled outward. According to airspace risk monitoring services tracking the region, France issued a formal notice in mid-July instructing its own operators not to enter Bahraini airspace at all, while the European Union Aviation Safety Agency separately advised operators to exercise extreme caution across Israel, Jordan, Oman, and Saudi Arabia. Bahrain's flight information region has closed and reopened multiple separate times throughout this conflict, and debris from intercepted drones has already been reported falling inside Abu Dhabi during the current round of escalation, alongside documented GPS spoofing incidents across the wider Gulf region. None of that is directly caused by the Mahan Air incident specifically, but it's the backdrop that incident happened against, a region where commercial aviation has effectively had to build entirely new contingency planning around the possibility of sudden, unpredictable military activity, disrupting civilian flight paths with almost no advance warning. There's a wider signal in this story too, and it's worth sitting with before we go any further. Al Jazeera's own framing of this moment calls it a new phase in what's actually a much older war. The long-running conflict between the Iran-aligned Houthis and the Saudi-led coalition that's backed Yemen's internationally recognized government since 2015. That's a decade-long fight that most of the world stopped paying close attention to once the 2022 truce took hold. What we're watching right now is that old, half-forgotten war getting reignited specifically because of its proximity to the much bigger, much newer war between Washington and Tehran, with each conflict now feeding directly into the other. Now let's get into the maritime blockade itself in more detail, because when I said the Houthis announced it, that undersells how serious this actually is. This wasn't just a statement, it's being described by multiple outlets as the opening of an entirely new front in the broader war. According to Reuters reporting, the Houthis' declaration specifically threatens to widen the conflict beyond the Gulf entirely, raising the risk to global energy supplies and trade routes that have nothing to do with the Strait of Hormuz. In their own statement, the Houthis' armed forces said they were declaring what they called a maritime embargo against, quote, the criminal Saudi enemy, close quote, based on what they described as an eye for an eye, effective immediately. And there's a detail buried in that reporting that connects directly to the wider Iran picture. According to Reuters, Iran had specifically pressed the Houthis to close the Bab el-Mandeb gateway to the Red Sea if the United States continued striking Iranian power infrastructure. So this blockade isn't purely a Houthi decision responding to Saudi actions around Sanaa. It's also, at least in part, Tehran cashing in a favor from an aligned proxy force to open a second maritime choke point against the West, layered directly on top of the Yemen-Saudi dispute we've been walking through. Yemen's Deputy Transport Minister, Ali Amer, said on social media that the Bab el-Mandeb Strait itself would be closed as part of this response, specifically framing it as retaliation for what he called Saudi Arabia's unjust blockade of Yemenis over more than a decade. And the Houthis went further than just announcing a policy. Their statement included language calling for what they described as general mobilization and a general call to arms, urging supporters to be fully prepared for all scenarios and to support what they called the fronts with fighters. That's not the language of a symbolic protest. That's a Yemeni faction publicly moving toward a war footing against Saudi Arabia specifically, layered on top of everything already happening with Iran and the United States. There's an important correction worth making here too, because good reporting means getting this right rather than repeating the cleanest, most convenient version of a story just because it flows better. Earlier, I described the strike on Sanaa Airport as something the Houthis blamed on Saudi Arabia, and that's accurate as far as it goes. But according to Al Jazeera's more detailed reporting, Yemen's internationally recognized government, the one based in Aden rather than the Houthi administration in Sanaa, actually claimed responsibility for that airport strike itself, saying it was carried out specifically to prevent the Iranian plane from landing in the capital. So there are genuinely two competing accounts of who was actually responsible for stopping that flight, the Houthis pointing at Saudi Arabia, and Yemen's own internationally recognized government claiming the action as its own. That kind of overlapping, contested responsibility is common in a conflict with this many parties involved, and it's exactly why I don't want to hand you a clean, simple villain narrative when the actual reporting shows something messier and more complicated. The economic angle here deserves real attention too, because it's not abstract. Saudi Arabia has an alternative to shipping oil through the Strait of Hormuz called the East-West Pipeline, or Petroline, which, according to regional reporting, has already been pushed to its full capacity of roughly 7 million barrels a day, specifically because of the ongoing blockade Iran has maintained on Hormuz since the opening days of this war back in February. That pipeline runs overland to the Red Sea, which means a Bab el-Mandeb closure wouldn't just threaten a secondary shipping route, it would threaten the primary alternative Saudi Arabia has been relying on precisely because its usual route through Hormuz has already been under pressure for months. If both choke points end up constrained at the same time, Hormuz through Iran's direct actions and Bab el-Mandeb through this new Houthi blockade, Saudi Arabia's oil export options narrow dramatically almost overnight. It's also worth noting that this isn't happening in a diplomatic vacuum either. According to reporting from The National, Oman has been leading mediation efforts throughout this period, working alongside the United Nations Special Envoy for Yemen, Hans Grunberg, to try to keep the broader peace process alive, even as these individual flashpoints escalate. A wider conflict directly involving the Houthis carries real risk of deepening regional tension and further escalating hostilities between the United States and Iran specifically, which is exactly why diplomats have been trying to keep this contained even while the maritime embargo announcement makes that containment look increasingly fragile. Let's push into a wider view of the overall war for a moment, because this Saudi-Yemen dispute isn't happening in isolation from the main US-Iran conflict, it's happening because of it. According to European aviation safety officials, a temporary ceasefire between the United States and Iran was initially announced back on April 8th and held until June 17th, when both countries signed a memorandum of understanding formally extending it another 60 days. That ceasefire effectively broke down in early July, shifting the region from a period of active, intense conflict back into what officials describe as heightened tension with sporadic but confined kinetic events, concentrated especially around the Strait of Hormuz and neighboring airspace. Iran, according to that same assessment, has maintained a high level of alert for its air force and air defense units nationwide throughout this period, which officials specifically flag as creating an increased risk of misidentification within Tehran's own flight information region, meaning even accidental civilian aircraft can end up caught in the crossfire of a nervous, fully activated air defense network. That's the environment this entire Mahan Air incident happened inside. It's not just that one flight got turned back. It's that it got turned back inside a region where Bahrain's airspace has closed and reopened multiple times, where the EU has issued advisories telling operators not to fly into the Emirates' flight information region at any altitude, and where debris from intercepted drones has already fallen inside Abu Dhabi during this current round of escalation. Every one of these individual incidents, the Saudi jets forced to retreat over Sanaa, the Mahan Air flight turned back over Oman, the Abha airport strike, is a symptom of the same underlying instability radiating outward from the core conflict between Washington and Tehran. One more detail worth flagging before we move on, because it tells you something about how carefully Riyadh is trying to manage this moment. According to Euronews reporting, there was no immediate response from Saudi Arabia to the Houthi blockade announcement itself, and it remains genuinely unclear whether the Houthis will actually resume the level of direct attack against Saudi Arabia they carried out earlier this year. That silence looks deliberate rather than accidental. A kingdom that's already absorbing direct Iranian strikes, while trying to preserve its stated neutrality in the broader war, has every incentive to avoid handing the Houthis a dramatic public reaction to amplify, even while quietly reinforcing its own defenses behind the scenes the way we discussed earlier with the Ukrainian interceptor deal and the Pakistani troop deployment. And it's worth being direct about the human cost sitting underneath all of this military and diplomatic maneuvering, because it's easy to lose that in a story built around jets, blockades, and strategic choke points. Yemen has already been enduring what the United Nations has described as one of the world's most severe humanitarian crises for close to a decade, worsened repeatedly by earlier rounds of exactly this kind of blockade. So, when Houthi officials frame their new maritime embargo as retaliation for what they call Saudi Arabia's siege on ordinary Yemenis, that grievance isn't manufactured out of nothing, even if the tactics being used in response carry their own serious risks to global shipping and regional stability. Whatever you think about who's right in this specific dispute over one airplane, the broader pattern of blockade and counter-blockade between Saudi Arabia and Yemen has consistently landed hardest on civilians who had no say in any of it. It's worth understanding, too, that this blockade rhetoric isn't happening in a historical vacuum, because Yemen and Saudi Arabia have been down this road before, more than once. Yemen's civil war itself dates back to 2014, when Houthi forces seized Sanaa and much of northern Yemen and forced the internationally recognized government into exile, and a fragile truce reached in 2022 has been the main thing holding a full-scale return to war at bay ever since. Saudi Arabia has imposed blockades on Yemen's own ports and airspace multiple times over the preceding decade, and Houthi leadership has threatened retaliatory action against Saudi shipping and infrastructure just as many times in response, going back to at least 2017. What's different this time is the surrounding context. Every previous round of this specific standoff played out as a largely contained two-party conflict. This time, it's unfolding directly inside a much larger regional war between the United States and Iran, which means a blockade announcement that might have stayed a Yemen-Saudi story in any other year is now getting folded into the broader narrative of the entire Middle East conflict, amplifying its stakes well beyond what either side controls entirely on their own. There's one more layer worth adding before we get to the strategic picture, because it shows how this specific Yemen-Saudi flashpoint sits inside an even wider web of alliances and rivalries than we've covered so far. The Houthis aren't just a Yemeni faction acting in isolation. They're one node in what's often described as Iran's broader network of regional partners, alongside groups operating in Lebanon and Iraq, all of which have played some role in this wider war since it began. When Tehran presses the Houthis to close Bab el-Mandeb in response to pressure on Iranian power infrastructure, it's using exactly the same kind of asymmetric, proxy-based leverage that's defined its strategy throughout this entire conflict, applying pressure through allied forces in multiple countries, simultaneously, rather than committing its own military directly in every theater at once. That's worth remembering. The next time a headline about Yemen or Lebanon shows up, seemingly disconnected from the main Iran story, because more often than not, there's a thread connecting it straight back to Tehran's broader strategic calculations. So let's bring this together into the actual strategic picture, because I think this is where a lot of coverage misses what's really going on. Saudi Arabia is trying to run an almost impossible balancing act right now. It's publicly refused to let itself be used as a launchpad against Iran. It's been attacked by Iran directly anyway. It's now found itself in a direct confrontation with Iran-aligned Houthi forces over aircraft access to Yemen, a confrontation where Saudi jets themselves were reportedly forced to retreat under fire at least once. And it's simultaneously trying to build up its own independent air defense capability through deals with Ukraine and a mutual defense pact with Pakistan, rather than leaning entirely on American protection the way it might have in past decades. That's a country trying to hedge in almost every direction at once, staying formally neutral in the big war while getting steadily dragged into smaller, sharper confrontations along its own borders and airspace. And the Houthis, for their part, are using this moment to escalate their own long-running fight with Saudi Arabia under the cover of the wider regional chaos. The blockade for blockade language Sari used isn't new rhetoric. It's a callback to roughly 12 years of conflict between the Houthis and the Saudi-led coalition that predates this entire Iran war by nearly a decade. What's changed is the environment around them. With Saudi air defense assets, American attention, and regional airspace all stretched thin by the broader conflict with Iran, the Houthis appear to be calculating that this is their moment to reassert pressure on Saudi Arabia, while everyone's attention is pointed elsewhere. None of this tells us exactly what happens next, and I want to be honest about that, rather than pretend there's a clean resolution coming. Because, frankly, nobody covering this conflict closely has a confident answer either. What we do know is that the pattern here has been consistent and repeating. An Iranian aircraft tries to reach Sanaa. Either Saudi Arabia blocks it directly, or it gets turned back before it arrives. The Houthis retaliate, sometimes against Saudi jets in the air, sometimes against Saudi airports on the ground, and each cycle seems to escalate slightly further than the one before it, from a destroyed runway back in April to Saudi jets allegedly forced to retreat in early July, to a declared maritime blockade and a direct missile strike on Abha by July the 20th.